Hi, this is Dr. Carolyn Coker Ross, bringing you the Inclusive Minds podcast. This podcast was inspired by the book of which I'm a co-editor entitled Anti-Blackness and the Stories of Authentic Allies, Lived Experiences in the Fight Against Institutionalized Racism. If you're a psychologist, a social worker, an addiction professional, or a healthcare provider, or anyone who wants to broaden your horizons, then this podcast is for you. The goal of the podcast is to help you understand some of the more complex issues facing our culture today. My guests are experts in their fields, and we'll be talking about a wide array of topics, including cross-cultural issues, the intersection of race and trauma, social justice, and health inequities. They will be sharing both their lived experiences and their expert opinions. The goal is to give you a felt experience and to let you know that you're not alone in being confused by these complex issues. We want to provide nuanced information with context that will enable you to make your own decisions about these important topics. Hi, everybody, and welcome to the show. Today, I have a wonderful new guest with me who is also, as I've mentioned many times before, one of the authors of our book, Anti-Blackness and the Stories of Authentic Allies, Lived Experiences in the Fight Against Institutionalized Racism. So her name is Dr. Ashanda Saint Jean, and she's a board-certified obstetrician and gynecologist with over 25 years of experience specializing in women's health and health equity. Dr. Saint Jean is recognized for her leadership in addressing maternal mortality, racial disparities, and access to care, holding key roles with the New York State and City Maternal Mortality Review Boards, the American College of Gynecology's National DEI Delegation, and the New York State Coalition for Doula Access. Her career is dedicated to advancing comprehensive patient-centered care for underrepresented women in New York. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're very welcome. Her chapter is amazing, and I hope you have gotten the book, and if not, you can see the link in the show notes to purchase the book, but you're going to want to read this one. So can I call you Ashanda?
Please do.
Okay, and you can call me Carolyn. So in your chapter, I'm going to quote, you wrote, Black birthing people are 3 to 4 times more likely to die in childbirth than their white counterparts in the United States. In New York State, the pregnancy mortality rate for Black birthing people is 5 to 6 times higher than it is for whites. And in New York City, it's 9.4 times higher than the national average, despite Black births representing only 15% of total births. So how can you help listeners understand those horrific statistics? What's happening with Black birthing mothers?
You know, it's something that truly impacts me personally and professionally as being a woman of color and understanding that many of my patients seek me out specifically because I'm a Black woman. And so there has been studies that show that the cultural concordance and congruency of care is applicable when you are mirror image to your provider. And so understanding these stats and this data, it's terribly troubling. And it completely removes the joy out of motherhood. You know, there is nothing I can say to explain away these numbers, but what I can say is that it is a public health crisis. And although we see that in the latest data that the numbers are improving for white non-Hispanic, for Asian and Hispanic, the number for Black women and Black birthing people continues to rise. So this should be unacceptable for everyone. And
So I've also seen, I read about Serena Williams' story. I think she wrote about it in Vogue or Vanity Fair, which was shocking. I mean, she's a wealthy woman. And in her first childbirth experience, she almost died because the doctor just wasn't listening to her. I think she has a history of blood clots to the lungs. She knew the symptoms. She knew what was needed to diagnose it. And she told the doctors over and over, and yet they ignored her and did whatever they thought they should do.
Lot of studies that have been done, and what they have found is that when you adjust for financial wealth, right, for education,
Yeah.
for socioeconomic status, for insurance type, and even where you deliver, Black, educated, or even graduate level women and birthing people, they still die at a higher rate than white, non-Hispanic women who have not even received a high school diploma.
Yeah. So why do you think that is? What's happening for
I
those women, or what's not happening for those women that's happening for white women and non-Hispanic people?
I think it's the impact of medical racism,
Mhm.
structural, interpersonal, and also systemic, because there's no biological difference. There's no biological difference. Remember, race is a social construct, it's not a biological construct. So there is no difference in our bodies and someone else's bodies.
Mhm.
But if we listen to these tragic stories about maternal deaths, and when we speak to the families or the partners, one of the things they say is that they didn't listen, right? There was no validation of their concerns. There was no kind of elevation of what they were saying. And often women of color and women, birthing people of color, they will tell you, I don't feel they're listening to me. They're not validating. I've had patients travel 2 hours just to see me because they know I will listen to them. You
Mm.
know, typically I get two types of patients. One who are already pregnant and they're scared of dying having their baby.
Mm,
Or the second is, I don't want to get pregnant because I don't want to die.
yeah. You
So we
shouldn't have
have,
to worry about dying when you're doing something that's so beautiful as having your first or your 10th baby. That shouldn't be part of the metric. In your book, you talk about the origins of obstetrics and gynecology and the Dr. Sims, who's considered to be the father of OBGYN. Can you tell us a little bit about that history?
yeah. So what people don't realize is that this lack of trust that has happened with people of color with medicine is not something that's a new onset. This is something that has been around for ages. And what we know with Dr. J. Marion Sims, and again, he has many instruments named after him and
Yeah,
procedures, physicians named after him. What he did was he practiced and actually fine-tuned his surgical technique on enslaved women. And he was doing that often without anesthesia.
right.
There was Betsy, Lucy, and Anarcha, and those are the ones we know the most. But sometimes they were then instructed to then practice on other enslaved women,
Mm,
right? And Anarcha sometimes had multiple surgeries in one day with no anesthesia.
mm,
So when we think about it in that framework, right, there's a long history dating back to the transatlantic slave trade to enslaved women coming to this country. Then we can talk about Henrietta Lacks, and that was in the 1950s, where this was a Black woman who went to Johns Hopkins because of vaginal bleeding all the time and was diagnosed with cervical cancer. And they took her cells, named them HeLa cells, which are still used today for medical research for vaccinations. And it wasn't until 2024 that her family was rightly financially compensated for her contribution to medicine. So,
so they took her cells without her permission or even telling her, right?
right, they
Yeah.
took it without her consent and
Mhm.
they still use it to this day.
Amazing. Yeah. So that, I mean, it's almost like it's baked into our DNA after it's a form of intergenerational trauma in a way, not to mention the other trauma that happened to Black women during slavery, which it could be loss of children, having to go back into the fields when they've just given birth. All of those things must have been passed down to some degree in our DNA if we're descendants from those women.
And then, I mean, I think also if you think about how we used to, first of all, enslaved women, enslaved Black women were breeders, right? Because
Yeah.
at one point slavery stopped, right? They stopped bringing people over from Africa, but they still wanted to have slaves. And so they were expected to have 10 and 12 and 13 babies and still work in the plantations, work in the fields, pick cotton. But I think in addition to that, what we have removed in terms of traditional kind of delivery patterns is having the obstetrician. It's a very sterile environment. If we go back to how deliveries were done in villages in Africa or even in enslaved times, it was a communal thing.
Yeah.
But
There
it
were
was
midwives.
midwives. If
Yeah.
we go back, I mean, I'm gonna date myself. Sorry, the listeners, please bear with me. But if you ever watch Roots,
Yeah. Roots.
there is a scene where Cicely Tyson is giving birth, right?
Mhm.
And she is in a hut, and the father is outside while
Yeah.
all the women are surrounding her and supporting her and coaching her and loving on her,
Mhm.
right? And one of those women is Maya Angelou. If you go back, go watch the
Oh
scene,
my goodness.
you
I
know,
didn't realize that.
and
Yeah.
you think about it and you look at these stars, right? And you think about this is how we used to deliver back then. Whereas
Mm.
now someone's telling you who can be in the room, who can't be in the room. You can't get up, you can't move around, you got to stay in the bed. There's so
Yeah.
many things that are taken away from our birthing people now that removes the joy of that maternal journey.
Yeah. It's so true. With the statistics being so much higher in New York City, for example, compared even to New York State, what's the explanation for that?
Well, I think first and foremost, we know that Black women and Black birthing people are experiencing these numbers at a higher rate, right? And if we look at the distribution of the demographic distribution of Black
Okay.
people, right, there's more in the five boroughs, right? And so that's probably why there's a distortion of those numbers. And if we even went more granular, Brooklyn has the highest delivery numbers of Black people,
Hmm.
and that includes African American, Caribbean American, African as well. And so,
Yeah.
what we look at the data in the five boroughs in New York City,
Mhm.
Brooklyn has the highest number. So they have the highest number of Black births,
Okay.
the highest mortality as well.
Oh, so sad. Yeah. And I would imagine, I mean, I've read stories about that if you lose a child that way, it's extremely traumatic and makes it very hard to recover and, have another child or even
But
be.
but we're talking about losing the mother, right? And
Oh,
so when
yeah,
you
that too.
lose the mother, so the data that I just said is maternal deaths. So
Okay.
we
Yeah.
have the highest number of births by Black women or Black birthing people in Brooklyn, and they have the highest maternal deaths.
Yeah.
So
So if you lose a mother, that's even more impactful because you have lost the caregiver for the family.
But not
So,
only that, the spouse, the
yeah.
partner, the family, the community. So everyone suffers. It's not something that only impacts, it's not a nuclear impact, it's
Mhm.
expanded. And I think that one of the kind of how I ground myself in this work, I went into OB because I wanted to be a part of the best day of someone's life. When I
Yeah.
first saw my first birth, I'm one of six children. And I
Oh.
remember when I was a medical student and my first day on the OB rotation, and I saw a vaginal birth, and I called my mother and I said, "You did this six times?" And I was fascinated, right? Because you can't believe that baby came out of that belly. And again, I'm 27 years in. I've delivered over 5,000 babies. Well, I stopped counting after 5,000. And I
Mhm.
can tell you this, I am still amazed every time I do a delivery because I cannot believe that baby was in there. And so imagine after training in Connecticut, coming back to New York City. In Connecticut, again, I had more, I did not have the same demographic population that I took care of New York City. When I was in Connecticut, the biggest thing we worried about were redheads. Redheads always bled. So we'd be like, get 4 units of blood because she's redhead, right?
Mhm.
But when I came to New York and I was at one hospital in Queens for 3 years, we had five maternal deaths.
Mm.
And so with that, I was like,
Heartbreaking.
I cannot believe that this is not the best day of someone's life. This is actually
Mm.
the worst day.
Yeah.
And so then I was just like, I didn't even believe that this is possible. I mean, of course, you're a doctor, but I had never seen it. And until you see
Yeah.
it, and you're like, oh my gosh, this changes the whole trajectory of why I'm doing this. And I remember just thinking about the family, seeing the partner, because again, I wasn't involved in that particular incident, but I was on call, right?
Yeah.
And it never kind of went away from me. And I said, well, what can I do to give a voice to the voiceless, right? How can I turn this trauma? Because, of course, my trauma is only like second victim trauma, right?
Yeah.
It's not,
Secondary
yeah,
trauma.
it's not
Oh,
like what the family's feeling, but how can I turn this into my purpose and my path. And that's when I started really doing the work of maternal mortality, because I think that if we can address this, and as we look at these numbers, and they're horrible, right? And we only have the numbers from like 2018, right? So
Mhm.
we don't have really numbers data before that because we didn't calculate it. So
Yeah.
we don't really know what it was before that. And so again, I feel that it is my purpose in this field is to help kind of address this, hopefully eradicate it, but also to give hope and joy back to people of color
Yeah.
so that they can have a joyful birthing and motherhood and maternal journey that they so rightly deserve.
Absolutely. So break down some of the individual factors that we put under the umbrella of racism, but one of them is maybe being underinsured or uninsured. What are some of the other factors that Black birthing people are
Yeah.
experiencing that may lead to that higher mortality rate?
I think a collection of those things in totality are called social determinants of health, right?
Right.
These are non-medical factors, right, that impact outcome. So they could be healthcare access, healthcare availability, they could be transportation, they can
Mhm.
be racism, they can be redlining,
Yeah.
they can be food insecurity, they can be health literacy. Sometimes patients don't really understand what you're telling them, right?
Right.
Are they receiving care with a trauma-informed lens? Because we know about generational trauma. We
Mm.
know about weathering, right? Are they
Well, you're going to have to explain that term because not everybody
yes.
listening may know about weathering.
Okay, so weathering is the impact of racism, discrimination over generations that
Mm.
impact your health condition. So it can, when some people say, well, I have hypertension, high blood pressure, because, often they think there are certain medical conditions that are caused by the impact of stress of racism and discrimination. And
Right.
this is over years.
Yeah, so it's kind of a wear and tear effect over not just years in your life, but generations.
Yes.
And those can be passed from one generation to the next.
From the womb to the tomb, they sometimes
Yeah.
say.
Epigenetics.
Yeah,
That's a
yeah.
whole nother
The
program, but we'll just mention it here. So
yeah,
those social determinants of health really describe the impact of racism and how it particularly impacts birthing people, as you're saying, the new term. And those are things that maybe the woman herself may not have control over, may not have control over her ability to get better insurance or to live in a better neighborhood where she has more access or to avoid being in a food desert, so she could have better nutrition.
or
Or
even healthy food options, right? Where
yeah,
we could be in right here in New York City, and there are no supermarkets, right? They go to the bodega, right?
yes.
Or they don't have the money to afford the organic things at Whole Foods, or they don't have farmers markets, right? And one of the things I had tried to do when I was in New York City is to get green dollars. So my patients, my clinic patients could then shop at the farmers markets, right? Many
Mm,
affluent neighborhoods, they have co-ops and they have food co-ops and they get fresh
yeah.
produce.
And
And
there's a
those
Whole Foods right in Soho, I found out when I visited my son.
well,
Right there in the middle of the
but
city.
you can go to some places in Harlem and there's no supermarket. People go to the bodega. And
Yeah.
so when we think about kind of what the impact of redlining, right? And then also kind of food deserts are not only a rural thing, it can happen in the urban settings as well.
Correct.
So want to be very kind of introspective of what is happening. Also, when we talk about quality healthcare, right? We know that when you have a provider that mirrors your cultural identity, right?
Mm,
There are things that are more understandable, right? And then we never talk about the impact of maternal mental health, PMADS, perinatal mood and anxiety disorders. Black women and Black birthing people are 40% impacted by anxiety and depression during their pregnancy. But again, they're often weaponized against them and their shame and stigma. So they will not tell you they're anxious, right? They'll just be anxious the whole pregnancy because they're thinking you're going to call ACS or some sort of child protective service, or you're going to think they're crazy, right? Because we still haven't normalized mental health in this country.
And there are a lot of reasons why there's a big stigma on against mental health, getting mental health care in the Black community as well. And we've talked about that in a previous podcast with Dr. Wigfall. So if you're interested in learning more about that, really refer to that podcast. But let me ask you another question. You said in your chapter, racism impacts the birthing journey, and it's a significant barrier to equitable healthcare, quality of healthcare, and overall healthcare access. So, do you have any specific examples from your 5,000 birthing experiences that can help people really get a sense of what this is like? Because we talk about concepts all the time, but when you break it down to an individual patient, not asking you to, say anything that's confidential, but just give some scenarios, some paint a picture for us of
I
what it might be like for a Black woman or Black birthing.
Yeah, I'll give you one example. I had a patient come in with her partner. They had a little disagreement about whether, they should bring the suitcase in or not, right? Because they didn't know if they were staying, right?
Mhm.
Well, their discord was witnessed, and all of a sudden, she was asked multiple times if she had domestic violence. Then they wanted to get a social worker, right?
Mhm.
And it just kept escalating because then she got angrier because they kept asking her the same things over and over. And
Yeah,
I said to the whole team, I said, if that was a Caucasian couple who argued about the same thing, right? Would they have gotten the same response?
yeah.
There have been times when I moved upstate, I started working in a more of a rural hospital.
Mhm.
Okay. There was not many people that looked like me. Okay. During COVID, there were certain restrictions. And one of the restrictions is you had to stay with your partner the whole time, right? Or if you left the hospital, you couldn't return, right? That was just one of their rules. We had an instance where most of the couples were Caucasian, right? And the
Mhm.
husband's like, I got to just go for a smoke. No problem, go for a smoke.
Mhm.
Whereas when I had Black couples, if you leave, you're not coming back. You
Yeah.
understand? So there
Mhm.
is a different type of care. I can give you another example. I had a patient, I will tell you, in my experience, if a baby tox positive for cocaine, that baby's not going home with the parent.
Yeah.
Okay. In New York City, if a baby tox positive for marijuana, there's a chance they're not going on, especially if they're a person of color. When I went upstate, I had babies that tox positive for cocaine, amphetamines, but their parents were Caucasian and they went home with their parents.
Wow.
Okay.
Mm.
So again, it's not weaponized against them, and I had a patient one time, she had no prenatal care. She had an extramural delivery, meaning that she delivered at home and the placenta was still in. So she came and we delivered the placenta. The baby tox positive. She did crystal meth and the baby tox positive for amphetamines. And she was like, I want to go home because she wanted to smoke
Mm.
or do whatever she does.
Mm.
And I said, well, listen, just stay the night because she was ready to sign out AMA and leave the
Wow.
baby. And I said, just do me this favor. I just want to repeat your blood work, make sure you're stable, what we call hemodynamically stable.
Mm.
I don't discharge babies. I'm an obstetrician. And so she agreed to stay. And I said, I promise you, I will arrive at 5 in the morning so that you can leave early.
Mhm.
And so when we made that agreement, right? She said, okay, I'll stay.
Mm.
And then the partner came and I think something happened because all of a sudden she was okay. She was different. She wasn't exhibiting behavior that would be consistent with withdrawal. Okay. And so she told me I'm leaving with my baby. And I said, oh, okay. I said, again, I don't make those decisions. I'm not a pediatrician. Can I tell you? She went home that the next morning. The baby stayed. ACS was called
Mm.
or Child Protective Services, what they call it upstate. And do you know, 2 days later, the baby was cleared to go home. And she looked me dead in the eye, not anyone else, not all the other Caucasian people, looked me dead in the eye. And she said, see, I told you I was going to take my baby home.
So the rules, you're saying basically the rules are different for Black women and their partners, or Black birthing people and their partners,
What I have witnessed. So I
from
don't
what
know if
you've
the rules are
witnessed.
different, but
Yeah.
the implementation of the rules, right? The
Mm.
enforcement, I have seen a two-tiered system.
Yeah. What about your own personal lived experience? Because, in the book, we try to include a lot of the professional experts
Mhm.
their expert opinion, but also their lived experience so people can get a sense of like what's it like for you to be uh, well, I know you have multiple identities here in terms of right. You'll have to say what they are because I don't
Well,
remember.
what I must say, because I always want to honor my mother and my father. My mother is Dominican; she's very fair. My father is from Alabama, and he's very dark.
Oh
Okay,
wow.
and so I
Okay.
am in the mix. They had 6 children. They met in the 6th grade. They were married 49 years. My dad has passed for the past 10 years. What I will say to you as a doctor, training in Connecticut, there were times where I had a patient one time, I was a very fast and a very skillful surgeon. And so sometimes when the privates would come in, they wanted me to operate with them so they can quickly finish and perhaps go back to their office. And
Yeah.
there was a big time executive's wife who came in and we did the surgery, went very well. The baby did very well. And when I went in to, round on her, do a post-op check, she asked me what was I doing in there and I could take the garbage. And I said, "No, no, no, I'm not housekeeping," because there's nothing wrong with being a housekeeper.
No,
Okay.
of
I
course
said,
not.
I said, "I'm not housekeeping. I'm doctor
But
at
it's the assumption that's offensive.
Oh
That
no, absolutely.
yeah.
And so then I said, "No, no, I'm doctor." At that time I was Dr. Phillips and I was the doctor who operated on you. And she goes, "No, you didn't."
Oh my.
She
Okay.
goes, she goes, "I don't want you in my room."
Whoa.
And I left the room, and then the next day there was a note on my locker saying, "Do not round on her." And then I was told that she doesn't want me. So that's not unusual. I purposely have every scrub embroidered. All of my white jackets are embroidered. Nobody ever thinks that I'm the
With
doctor.
your name, you're saying. With your
With
name
my
and
name,
MD.
Ashanda Saint Jean, MD, FACOG.
Okay.
Because nobody, I mean, I would tell you, I was the chair in my department, and I was walking in to do a C-section at 7 o'clock in the morning. It was scheduled for 7:30. And in this rural hospital upstate, I had security said, "Where the hell do you think you're going?" And I said, "I'm Dr. St. Jean, and I'm here to perform a C-section, and I'm the chair of the department." There, and now, mind you, scrubs are embroidered, white jackets embroidered, ID is showing.
Yes.
Okay. There's many times I may go in with a white medical student, especially if it's a white male medical student. Patients will say, "Well, I want him to do the surgery." I'm like, "Well, if you look at your bracelet, that's my name. I'm Ashanda. He's not Ashanda, and
Yeah.
he's a student." There's been times I had a time one time where because for me, in addition to the racism and prejudice on what I look like, I also appear young.
Yeah.
And so I had one time where when I was running 6 clinics for a major medical center in New York City, I had a patient one time said, "I would like a doctor who's more experienced." It was nobody more experienced than me.
Yeah. All right.
And so, but I said, "You know what? I don't listen. You learn to have thick skin,
Mhm.
and it shouldn't be that way." But what happened is then she saw a white female doctor who had a lot of salt and pepper hair.
Mhm.
And the day of her surgery for her C-section, I was actually called in because she was hemorrhaging and had what we call uterine atony, where her uterus wouldn't contract down after the delivery of the baby and the placenta. And I literally had to go in and do a special type of procedure technique to save her uterus. And after that, the doctor said, "Ashanda, I'm going to tell her that you came in and saved her life or whatever." And I said, "No, don't do that." And I said, "You know why? Because I don't do it for that reason. My purpose is more than that. So I don't need any accolades from anyone. What I do is of a higher calling and a higher reason.
Yeah.
And so I will always help others because I think that I have been blessed with this gift, this talent. But I think also I have been on assignment to help other Black women and birthing people. And
Yeah.
that's what I try to do.
That's beautiful. I love that. Just as a last question before we end, I wanted to just ask you, do you think that because I know you're involved in the state at the state and the local level in New York on this topic, do you expect that the changes in the administration in Washington will have a better impact, no impact, worse impact on maternal health than before?
What I will say is I will always remain hopeful that each day we will strive towards improving the quality and the access and the availability to all birthing people so that everyone can experience joy during their maternal journey.
Are
So
you
I
seeing that
always
hope come to fruition, though?
it's hard to say, right? And it's hard to know just yet. I will always look at the glass half full and remain positive, and I'm just hopeful that humanity will always win.
What kind of advice can you give to birthing people, people who are planning to have a baby, who have that fear inside of them, or people who are already pregnant? What advice can you give to them so that they can get the best care for themselves?
I always think of a toolkit, right? So before I even talk about the components of the toolkit, first I will say is you deserve to be heard, you deserve to be listened to, and you deserve to be valued. So that's at the bedrock of everything. What I would say is start planning your pregnancy. 50% of pregnancies in this country are unplanned, right? So as much as you can plan, I would say start taking your prenatal vitamins 3 months before you conceive. Those things. I would say research and select your provider. And the provider can look so many different ways. You can have a midwife, a nurse practitioner. You can have a family medicine doc, or
Yeah.
you can have an OB.
Mhm.
There's a wonderful app called the Earth app. Take B out of it, an IRTH app, and it has a lot of providers of color, and they have kind of a scale and those type of things, and actual responses from people. So I would say pick your provider. Make sure they have shared decision making. Make sure they have a trauma informed lens. Make sure they value you. I would also say if you can select your hospital, visit the L&D, right?
Labor
Go to
and
labor and
delivery.
delivery.
Yeah.
Go there, look at the room, see if your vibe, see a feeling, see how you feel being there.
Mhm.
I would say also get a doula.
Tell people what a doula is because it's
Doula
cool.
is a non-clinical support person during labor, but they can also be intrapartumly. So they can come to your prenatal visits with you and they can be coming to you afterwards in postpartum. But what they are trained and skillful at is emotional, physical support during your birthing journey. And they're also an opportunity for advocacy and empowerment as well. And sometimes they translate what we're saying. I love this one story where I had this patient and everybody was happy and we're all excited and she has her doula. And then I went to my office, I came back, I go in the room, everyone's angry. I was like, what's going on? And what we do in this country is how you doing? Fine.
Mm.
Everyone says fine, but they're not fine. And what I did was I asked the doula if they can come outside the room and can I talk to them? So she comes out and I was like, what's going on? What happened? Like the whole mood changed. And she said she doesn't like the blood pressure cuff. I was like, that's it?
Wow.
Like,
Okay.
well, the nurse said she can't take it off and it's bothering her arm and it's just and I said, "Oh, okay, that's easy." I
Mm.
said, "They only have to check her blood pressure every half hour, so the nurse will come in, put it back on, and then take it off." And she goes, "Well, no, the nurse said no." And I said, "It's okay. Let me take care of it from here." And so we took off the blood pressure cuff, and then immediately it was a whole different vibe and just you could palpate the tension before. And now she was smiling again, laughing, and those are the
So
things.
what was it really the blood pressure cuff or was it just the sense that someone wasn't listening to her and that she wasn't being heard about her feelings?
I think it was both. I think, and the third thing was she felt that she didn't have any power.
Yeah. So there you go.
So how do we do that? And so when I tell you doulas are incredible, and I go back to that scene in Roots, right?
Mhm.
We're
Yeah.
used to birthing with a community around us, right?
A
That is
support
support
community
us.
around us.
And that's what doulas do, and they're actually incredible. So
Yeah,
that's another thing. I would also say get a birth plan. I provide a skeletonized birth plan so that number one, I can go over education about what's going to happen in the moment, right? To
right.
kind of, because we always fear the unknown. We all do this. right? So this is not something new for birthing people, but having that skeletonized birth plan, I know that you may want to put lipstick on before the baby delivers for the pictures. That's fine. You may want delayed cord clamping. You may want so and so to cut the cord. You may want someone to cut half another one. I don't know that. And in the moment, you're not going to be able to tell me that.
Right.
So I love birth plans. I would say also, please attend childbirth classes as much as you can. You know, a lot of these classes are now virtual, and you're able to commune with people around the same gestational age, and you get to talk to each other, right? Because
That's
you're
so
not alone in
helpful.
what you're feeling, you
Yeah.
know? So those are the things that I would prescribe as a toolkit for patients. And I think some of those things, if not all of them, will help you return that joy into
Yeah.
your motherhood journey.
Very good advice. Thank you so much, Dr. St. John. It's been a pleasure to talk with you. Appreciate you
Oh,
being on the show.
likewise. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Thanks for listening. Please subscribe to the Inclusive Minds podcast so we can let you know when the next great guest comes on. The link to subscribe is in the caption below.